The Almighty Key, written by Haywhat. You're crazy, mate. I'm sorry, but this is getting weird. Look, I know you've been through a lot. Hell, we both have. But this isn't a normal conversation to be having. It was cute when you were a kid, but now you're 15. You should be chasing girls, supporting Man United, or chilling on Netflix. Not all this supernatural ghost bullshit. They're dead, okay? They're gone. There's nothing we can do about it. You can't see them, and honestly, I'm worried that you think you can. Have you said this shit to anyone else? Mark looked nervous. He carved into the Cumberland sausage, forcing a huge chunk into his mouth and chewing frantically. My foster brother had always been an animal when it came to eating, a true carnivore, so to speak. Kind of like a werewolf, actually, I thought. Perhaps best not to vocalize that right now. I smiled at the thought, and proceeded to push the overcooked bacon around my plate. A group of old builders were brutishly sharing sexual conquests over coffee, banging the table across us in celebration. It was barely 10 a.m. I hated this cafe. Gray! Gray! I swear to God, mate, you're not even listening. This is serious. I've got the school calling me up, saying you're creeping out teachers. Not students, fucking teachers. Miss Trunch literally called you a schizophrenic. This stops now. I need to hear you say it, and I need to see you mean it. Fuck me, Gray. Look at me when I'm talking to you. I looked up. Mark was pointing his fork straight at me, an angry flush across his face. Less than a meter behind him, two figures hovered, translucent and vaguely glowing. A young waitress, carrying a tray of coffees, walked straight through them, before sneezing and dropping the coffees with a crash, sending Mark into a brief fit of panic. The builders cheered boisterously, applauding her mistake. I laughed to myself and noticed the two spirits join me, giggling in unison. The waitress seemed utterly baffled by what had just happened. You're right, Mark. I'm sorry. There's no such thing as ghosts. That would be crazy. Mark nodded in agreement. We finished our breakfast in silence. Mark had offered to drive me home, but I politely declined, insisting I'd rather walk. Truth be told, I had no intention of ever going home again. Instead, I began towards the town center. I had one thing on my mind. Looking back, it had all become far too overwhelming. I could sense monsters, but I couldn't touch them or fight them away. Instead, I was helpless, left for them to prey on me with no defense. The frustrating thing was that there always felt like there was a barrier between them and I. I could never communicate with them, and I always felt that if I could only talk to them, just ask them why me, then perhaps I could live with it. Maybe I could even help them. I'd mostly dealt with this alone. I shared snippets with my parents, and they had supported me unquestioningly, up until the point of their sudden death. For the next 3 years, I let it ball up inside me, tried to ignore it, but that was impossible. Finally today, I built up the courage to tell Mark, only for him to confirm what I feared. Maybe I was crazy. I was definitely tired, and now I was set in my decision. There appeared to me only one way out. I had picked the perfect spot, a bridge overlooking a river far below that opened out to the sea. Lilies grew amongst the reeds, and the water teemed with life. It seemed like a peaceful place to die. I bought 2 cheese and onion sandwiches as a final meal, and made my way through the town. I was followed by the usual gaggle of ghosts, each moaning and babbling behind me. The fresh springtime air was tainted by the stench of a werewolf, 2 or 3 kilometers away, and pierced by high-pitched banshee shrieks, a personal favorite of mine due to their sulky, self-absorbed nature and complete lack of personal space. I chose to ignore them. They were someone else's problem now, presumably. Finally, the bridge appeared in sight, calmly overlooking the river below. It was built from red bricks and white triangular wooden beams that had withstood British weather for over 100 years. My foster mother would bring me here to feed bread to the ducks on Sundays. We'd discuss the differences between mallards and marbled ducks. I'd race sticks in the river, and she'd laugh at my irrational fear of swans. It was my fondest memory. I perched myself on the edge of the rail, looked outwards towards the sea, and smiled. With my feet hanging over, I unwrapped the sandwich and began tucking into my last meal before jumping to my death. It was surprisingly delicious, and for a brief moment, It was as though I was tasting food for the first time. The usual smell of rotting flesh seemed to disappear with each bite, and I was suddenly hit by the overwhelming and admittingly welcome scent of lavender, fresh bread, and cut grass. I was also increasingly becoming aware of the fact the smells and tastes were getting stronger and were not my imagination. I started to panic, realizing my senses were being manipulated by something close. And yet, as quickly as the panic arrived, it was gone. Drawn from me like poison from a wound, I decided to ignore it, or more, embrace it. I was here for a single purpose. Whatever this being was, I wasn't going to let it change my fate. I closed my eyes, and in one motion, I rocked forward, over the edge of the bridge, and down towards the beckoning water below. It was not the river, however, that engulfed me, but something else, not unlike water, calm, but altogether warmer. White light seemed to surround me, forcing my eyes closed, and when I finally opened them, the brightness settled. I was back on the bridge. A small winged boy, no older than 5, was sitting next to me. We were both holding sandwiches. His eyes were astonishing, seemingly brown, blue, and green all at once, whilst a deeper, more curious color I had not quite seen before swirled within them. They seemed ageless, and the most beautiful things I had ever seen. In an instant, they met mine, and whilst his mouth remained still, I heard his voice. "Do not be afraid, old friend. There will come a time when you are ready to go. On that day, I will take you gladly, and we shall both finally return home. But not today. Today, war begins." The boy winked and was gone. I sat alone. Bewildered by the experience, I stumbled home. The sun seemed brighter, and looking up made me nauseous. I felt drained. Psychic connections had left me tired in the past, but I had never experienced more than a distant whisper, a scratch against armor. This was different. What I felt was indescribably powerful, and I felt it awaken something in me. I understood him, every word. As I passed a local park and turned towards my house, I suddenly realized how quiet it was, much quieter than usual. Looking behind, I saw why. My ghosts had gone. I expected it to settle me, but instead I threw up next to the park bench. After 2 more incidents, I gratefully made it home, although my sight still hadn't recovered. My foster parents had left Mark and I the place in their will, but it had seen better days. A pile of graying books by the door nearly made me trip as I essentially felt my way to the cluttered kitchen. I quickly downed a glass of water, and then my body crashed onto the sofa. As I drifted off, I could have sworn I heard distant voices of men arguing between themselves and gradually approaching. My eyes open. It's freezing, and I'm bare-chested. Deep blue waves of sand crash into a pink ice field, stretching as far as the eye can see. Huge icebergs climb out towards the horizon, glowing like rubies within great diamonds. The sand rises in a 100-foot wave before crashing against the icy shore. The sky is empty, an endless, distant void. In the center, a crater overflows with enormous skeletons of strange, tusked beasts. 2 thrones, carved in ice, sit in the center, and appear to have grown out of the ground over many years. I am sitting in one. My skin feels like it's on fire. I try to move, but realize my skin is frozen to the chair and let out a scream in pain. The second throne sits empty before me. Can you hear me? Hello? Can you understand what I'm saying? For a moment, I'm confused. Then quickly I arrive at the truth. The Sandmen are feeding on me again, and someone is trying to wake me up. I shake myself, trying to ignore the very real agony I'm in. You're in a dream, I think loudly. Wake up! This is the Sandmen. Don't let them get inside your head. Ah, fantastic. Although, let's face it, that ship has sailed, my lord. Mark, get over here. I told you something was different. He even calls us Sandmen. Before I have time to react, the sand begins to rise around the second throne, kicking up a great blue storm and swirling up into the sky before rocketing against the throne twice. When the clouds finally disperse, 2 short, fat men are revealed in silk cloaks. one perching awkwardly on each arm. They have pale, translucent skin and a large trunk-like nose that curves around their mouth before hanging freely off their jaw. I have never seen a Sandman in this form before, and it completely throws me. The one on the left, slightly shorter and slightly wider, pulls a note from his pocket and clears his throat as well as his trunk. Greetings, almighty Key. Welcome to my humble sand. My name is Gus, and this is my fellow Sandman, comrade and long-term lover, Mark. The second Sandman waves slightly and smiles, I assume. The surrounding icebergs start to glow in unison, turning a pale shade of lilac. It suddenly dawns on me that I can understand what they are saying. What did they just call me? I would first like to deeply and dark-heartedly apologize for consuming you for so long, in our nature and all that jazz. We had very conflicting emotions about the whole thing, if I'm being honest. Emotions we're only now beginning to understand. Therefore, to the almighty Key, we are truly sorry. Next, we would like... Well, I would personally like to say how thrilled we are that you personally got in touch and how excited we are to finally die. I mean, 4,000 years is plenty of time to be stuck on Earth for us. And I, for one, will be happy to finally be at peace, especially with the war looking the way it does. I mean, I didn't even know this was an option until today, and Floyd said, "Sorry, I'm rambling. Anyway, we graciously accept your offer and await your further command, almighty Key." The second Sandman bursts into applause before shaking his comrade and lover's hand passionately. Suddenly they embrace, and their trunks begin to intertwine, before almost realizing where they are, and somewhat reluctantly stopping. They turn towards me eagerly. Another great wave of sand rises behind them in apprehension. I blink. What's happening? The key to what? Well, purgatory, of course. The Sandman responds to my thoughts immediately. I open my mouth instinctively to ask another question, but at once the sky flashes and turns a sickening yellow. The wave breaks upon me, tossing aside bone and shattering the throne upon impact, throwing me backwards. I can hear the Sandman scream out in the distance, terrified. The ice begins to catch fire, and I'm taken away by the sand. A deeper, commanding voice swallows me. "You will free me. Together we will rise." The sand tightens around me, twisting and turning my body. Razor quick, it slashes out at me, leaving a deep cut in my right cheek. I raise my hand to cover my face. A Sandman is still screaming, or maybe grieving, and as the storm begins to deafen me, the sand starts to take form. Now a deep black stone, 6 great fingers curl into a fist, flying towards me and striking me head on. I was brought back to reality with a jolt. Gasping for breath, I rolled off of the sofa and onto the mustard carpet. My hands were clammy, and I had sweated straight through my t-shirt and jumper. Now crouched over on all fours, I began to feel the nauseousness return. In one swift motion, I opened my mouth and projectile vomited blue sand across my living room before collapsing on my back. After 2 or 3 minutes, my breathing began to slow, and I was finally able to begin processing what happened. I had been dreaming, and I had attracted some Sandmen, but then I had understood the Sandmen. I had seen them, and I mean really seen them for the first time. We'd engaged in literal conversation, which meant that they had understood me too. Then I remembered the voice, the second creature. That was no Sandman. That much I was sure of. It felt hostile. I reached out and grabbed a handful of blue sand, now spread across my floor. It was very much real. I wiped the sweat from my face, and when I looked at my hands, they were covered in blood. Raising myself sluggishly, I turned to the large mirror and saw myself in the reflection. Despite being covered in blue sand, my attention was drawn to one thing, a long, deep cut on my right cheek, oozing blood. A terrifying realization swept through me, and at once I was both petrified and excited. Not only can they understand me now, they can touch me.